Today we want to talk about Proverbs, and the wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is a distinct category of literature in the Bible. It was also something that's much older than the Bible. There are long documents of instructional literature from the ancient Near East, especially from Egypt. Now, first thing you may notice about it is there is no claim here of divine revelation whatsoever. The characteristic formulation is, listen, my son, to your father's teaching. That's the trademark, if you like, of Proverbs. Secondly, the ones in the Hebrew Bible say nothing whatsoever about Israel. Somebody's phone. No, they say nothing about Israel. There is a tradition of Proverbs is ascribed to Solomon. There are traditions associating wisdom with Solomon, but even in the case of Solomon, there is nothing said about Israel. We'll see when we get to the book of Job, he's in the land of Uz, which might as well be Oz. But the main thing is, it's not Israel in particular. Now, that will change eventually when we get to the deuterocanonical books of Ben Sira and the Wisdom of Solomon. They do work in and incorporate the traditions about Israel, but in the mainline wisdom tradition, its reflection on humanity as such, human beings as such. This is what it's about. The oldest wisdom books that we have are from Egypt in the 3rd millennium BC, back about 22 or 2300 BC. And these were, for the most part, for training scribes. And the way they did it was by copying out Proverbs. Actually, when I started school, that's the way they used to teach us how to write. Write a proverb on the blackboard, of the type, honesty is the best policy. This kind of thing. You might say the wisdom of them, not necessarily all that profound, but it's kind of basic educational material, and you hope to teach people a little ethics or moral behavior incidentally. But basically, it was for people to copy out and learn how to write. Now, that's the way the wisdom tradition forms. It's associated with Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 and following. It says, God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding, as vast as the sands on the seashore. So that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, children of Mahol. His fame spread through all the surrounding nations. Now, I'm afraid mentioning those names has lost a lot of its point. Nobody has any clue anymore who Heman, Calcol, and Darda were, but presumably they were famous people in their day. And so, but notice again, not Israelite. Solomon, of course, was supposed to have married Pharaoh's daughter. And so at one point, scholars suppose that in the age of Solomon, there had been a kind of enlightenment, that Israel sort of came of age and entered into diplomatic relations with other countries and caught up on all the wisdom of the other peoples round about. Now, people are much more skeptical about that nowadays. As we'll see in a minute, at least part of the book of Proverbs is said to have been collected in the time of Hezekiah. And the prevailing opinion nowadays, whether it be right or wrong, is that it was only in the time of Hezekiah, which is to say about 700, that Jerusalem became a big enough city to have any kind of diplomatic apparatus. Now, I'm still inclined to think that even a very small place probably needed a few people who could write. And this is the way this tradition would have started in any case, was in teaching scribes how to write. Very few people in the ancient world could write. It becomes much more widespread when you get down to the Hellenistic period. In Jewish tradition, they say that schools were introduced perhaps in the 1st century BC, but it's not clear just what is meant by a school there. We know in the book of Ben Sira, it seems that he took in pupils, but he seems to have done so on a tutorial basis, kind of like the Greek Sophos. You went along and knocked on his door, and he gathered a few disciples and ran a little Beit Midrash, or school, that way. But this was not anything like public education as it would become known in later times. That passage in 1 Kings goes on to say that Solomon composed 3,000 proverbs. His songs numbered 1,005. He could speak of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. People came from all the nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon. They came from the kings of the earth to hear his wisdom. Now, the impression you get from that is that his wisdom is, kind of random knowledge about nature. It's not especially religious, but it's anything you might want to know. And this, I think, is true by and large of the ancient Near Eastern wisdom too, for the most part. Now, some of it certainly will be moral, but a lot of it is just, information, things you might want to know for one reason or another. Now, the book of Proverbs, as we have it, can be divided into a number of sections. First and most obviously, the first 9 chapters are different in kind from the rest of it. They're not really proverbs, they're speeches. Michael Fox wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on Proverbs. He talks about them as lectures, but they're longer, poetic, somewhat poetic at least, but longer units. Once you get that, you're into sentences. That is to say, every sentence pretty much, with a few exceptions, is a self-contained unit. 10:1 to 22:16 are said to be Proverbs of Solomon, although that's certainly not how they originated. Then 22:17 to 24:22, called the Words of the Wise. But that passage is of some importance because it seems like a summary of the wisdom of Amenemopet. So it appears that the Hebrew scribes had some familiarity with Egyptian scribes and copied some material from them. Then 22, 23 to verse 34, these also belong to the wise. The next important connection is chapters 25 to 29, and these are Proverbs of Solomon that the men of Hezekiah collected. And then you have a few addenda at the end, the words of Agur, the words of Lemuel, and a poem on the woman of valor. Now, in all probability, Proverbs originated as folk literature. You get Proverbs everywhere. Every country on earth, I think, probably has some kind of Proverbs that try to distill wisdom into short, pithy sayings that are easy to remember. How far they were, the two main theories about the development of the early wisdom literature is that it was popular wisdom, which you think it was to some degree, or then that it was court instruction, the material used for the training of scribes. And these are not incompatible with each other because they probably used folk proverbs and collected them into instructional material for the training of scribes. So what do we get in them? Well, first thing you get in them are simple observations. And let's Proverbs 24:30 and following. I passed by the field of one who was lazy, by the vineyard of a stupid person, and see, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. And I saw it and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed robber. Now, this is material partly for home instruction, partly what you want to tell your children. So, warnings against laziness. Again, in chapter 26, verse 13. Verse 13, the lazy person says, there is a lion in the road. There is a lion in the street. As a door turns on its hinges, so does a lazy person turn in bed. The lazy person buries a hand in the dish and is too tired to bring it to the mouth. The lazy person is wiser in self-esteem than 7 who can answer discreetly. So, this is the kind of wisdom that you're getting here, kind of observation, and there's a very strong claim in this material that everything is based on observation. Now, in fact, a lot of it wasn't. A lot of it just became kind of dogma that was repeated from one generation to another. But at the root of it, there is a claim that it is supposed to be based on observation. Another favorite one that they liked so much that they actually have it twice. In chapter 25, verse 24, it is better to live in a corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. If any of you are living in close quarters, with a roommate at this time when you can't go out, you can take this one to heart. That one also appears in chapter 21, as far as I know. It's the only one that is actually given twice. They were so impressed with it. And in chapter 3, verse 9 and following, who has woe, who has sorrow, who has strife? Those who linger late over wine, those who keep trying mixed wines, do not get wine when it is red and it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. At the last, it bites like a serpent, stings like an adder. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind will utter perverse things. It struck me, you will say, I wasn't hurt. They beat me, but I didn't feel it. When shall I awake? I'll have another drink. So, one of the enjoyable things, I think, about the book of Proverbs is human nature hasn't actually changed all that much. Most of these problems are still with us to some degree or another. Besides simple observations like that, if you want to expand, it's a long way from there, you might say, to philosophy. But actually there is a continuum, I think, that one can trace. And you even see it develop to a good degree in the later wisdom literature. But the first thing you do to expand your observations is notice analogies, notice comparisons. So chapter 25, verse 11, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. Like a gold ring or an ornament of gold is a wise rebuke to a listening ear. Like the cold of snow in the time of harvest are faithful messengers to those who send them. They refresh the spirit of their masters. Like clouded winds without rain is he who boasts of a gift and never gives it. And so forth. Let's see. Chapter 26, verse 11. Like a dog that returns to its vomit is a fool who reverts to his folly. Like an archer who wounds everyone is one who hires a passing fool or drunkard. So, in 26:17, like somebody who takes a passing dog by the ear is somebody who meddles in a quarrel not his own. So, again, a good proverb like that is one that makes a witty comparison. Some of these are wittier than others, but some of them are pretty witty, I think. Now, in addition to observations, comparisons, then you also have commands and prohibitions, and these, can be pretty sententious, pretty commonplace kinds of thing. They're not, again, necessarily moral. Some of them are, but not all of them. Chapter 23. When you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what is before you. Put a knife to your throat if you have a big appetite. Do not desire the ruler's delicacies, for they are deceptive food. Do not wear yourself out to get rich. Be wise enough to desire when your eyes light upon it, it is gone, for suddenly it takes wings to itself. Do not eat the bread of the stingy. It's like a hair in the throat. Eat and drink, they say to you, but they don't mean it. And you'll end up vomiting up the little you have eaten. So, I put something like that in the Bible. And I think, you see, the point of this literature was to prepare people for life. It's general education. Now, they will at some point or other, bring God into it, but most of the time they do not. Most of the time, the world is left to run, so to speak, on its own machinery. That there is a chain of act and consequence that is thought to work. God presumably put this in motion, and now I think it was Leibniz was the philosopher who compared the world to clock. The clockmaker sets it up, but once it gets going, you leave it alone. You don't meddle with it. I think that's pretty much the view that you have in Proverbs of the way the world works. In chapter 26, you get a little bit of moral advice, if it is moral. Do not answer fools according to their folly, or you will be a fool yourself. Answer fools according to your folly, or they will be wise in their own eyes. Which are you supposed to do? Now, we'll see this next day when we look at the book of Koheleth. Wisdom doesn't lie in the specific course of action that's recommended. It lies in the timing. It lies in knowing when to apply it. So the point here, what we meet in Koheleth, is there is a time to hate as well as a time to love, a time to kill as well as a time to cure. Timing is everything. And here, it's all in the timing as to whether you should answer a fool according to his folly. There are times when you should, and times when you should not. Now, God, as I say, comes into this in some part through the working of, to being the guarantor of the working of the chain of act and consequence. Now, this is probably the strongest dogma that you get in all of the wisdom literature, I think. A typical example of it, he who digs a pit falls into it. No smoke without a fire. The assumption is that everything is connected. Nothing just happens at random. So, if a disaster befalls a people, for example, there must be a reason for it. You cannot have just random occurrences. Now, besides being the guarantor like that, the other place where God comes into it is in a sense of limit. Chapter 27, verse 1, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. So, it's for human beings to make plans. Man proposes, God disposes, as they say. This is the point, that it's at the limit of what humans can control that you encounter God. And I mean, this in a way is theology by default. It's more really a theology of human limitation. Consequently, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And when they said fear, they meant fear. They also have meant reverence a lot of the time, but I think it's also fear of both the unknown, fear that somehow or other you might offend a higher deity. You will find analogies comparing God with a king. And when you're around a king, you have to be very careful, because if you offend him, it could have dire consequences. And this, I think, is the way they thought about God too. So that what fear of the Lord then amounts to is a sense of reverence, of humility, not claiming too much. This is very much common ancient wisdom. In Greek tragedy, the great sin was hybris, somebody who rises above his station. And anyone who rises too high would be cast down. So you've got to know your limits. That's, I think, what you have also in the story of Adam and Eve. You know, that you are put in your place. You're not meant to rise above it. This, I think, is the common ancient Near Eastern wisdom. Now, they do have some more of the other things that we would regard as more morally edifying, perhaps. For example, there are many injunctions scattered through Proverbs on how you shouldn't rob the poor, that you shouldn't abuse people who are weaker than you, because God may get you if you do. The Lord is the one who looks out for that. This is also true, I should say, in Egyptian wisdom. And also in Egyptian wisdom, even though the Egyptians were polytheists, they will talk about the God or the divine, by which they just mean, some God. Doesn't matter really which one, but that there is some kind of higher power that will look out, and provide retribution if you do something that is out of line. One other thing before we leave this main part of Proverbs, in chapter 10, well, let's see, where's... Yeah, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry. This is verse 3. He thwarts the craving of the wicked. This now we saw also in the Psalms, that the one that says, I was young, now I am old, but I've never seen a righteous person go hungry. Because, you see, on the one hand, they want to maintain a strong connection of act and consequence. They also want to maintain that virtue pays, that virtue leads to good results. The problem with it, of course, is that this doesn't always seem to be the case in practice. And that's what we will come up against in the book of Job next week. But it is probably the fundamental dogma of the wisdom literature, and it does become a dogma. The wage of the righteous leads to life. The gain of the wicked is sin. Now, these tend to be couched in very general terms. They're kind of abstract principles, very hard to support them from actual observation. But you get a layer of that kind of material. Now, there is another layer, which I would tend to think of as being the older layer, that's really, quite unsentimental, of the type that says that anyone who meddles in a quarrel not his own is like somebody taking a passing dog by the ear. There's another one that says, never go surety for another. Why should your bed be taken from under you? Now, again, you can counter that. You'll find examples where they will say you should help people if they're in need. But there is a kind of hard-headed practical concern for practical results that will also lead to things that are not terribly inspiring, shall we say. But at the same time, there is also this dogmatic layer that you tend to come back to, that's kind of superimposed on the layer of experience. Okay, anybody got any question on this so far? Well, if we turn back to the opening chapters, two of the most discussed chapters in Proverbs are chapter 7 and chapter 8. In chapter 7, you have the warning against the Isha Zara, which is could be the foreign woman, the strange woman, the other woman, if you like. Karen Newsom, who taught at Emory for many years, had the saying that Proverbs is basically men talking to men about women. And there's certainly a lot of that. And, it's not, I wouldn't say that it's misogynistic at all, really, but it's very suspicious of women. So here, at the window of my house, I looked out through my lattice. This is verse 6. And I saw among the simple ones, I observed among the youths, a young man without sense, passing along the street near the corner, taking the road to her house in the twilight of the evening. Then a woman comes toward him, decked out like a prostitute, wily of heart. Now, you would take it from that, I think, that the woman in question is not actually a prostitute. She's just decked out like one. But she is loud and wayward, and she seizes him and kisses him and says, I had to offer sacrifices. Today I paid my vows. So now I have come to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh. Come, let us take our fill of love to the morning, for my husband is not at home. He has gone out on a long journey. There are several scattered warnings in Proverbs against adultery. And the basic argument against adultery is it's dangerous. You could get beaten up. If her husband finds out about it, he could be really mad. Now, of course, if you were following Deuteronomy, you could be executed for it, but they don't seem to be following Deuteronomy, actually, in this. There isn't, as far as I can see, any awareness of the law of Moses in the book of Proverbs. Now, they do use a word like Torah for instruction, and some of the things they say it are later on applied to the Torah, especially in rabbinic literature. But I don't think there is any presupposition of a revealed law anywhere in Proverbs. The concern is what will come of this. So it says, right away he follows her, goes like an ox to the slaughter. He is like a bird rushing into a snare, not knowing that this will cost him his life. Now, if this is indeed a warning against adultery, it's probably a bit overstated, you would think. But I think, you see, it's more than a warning against adultery, because the chapter, I think, also has some symbolic significance. That it is that the foolish woman is the antitype to wisdom, and wisdom is also personified as a woman. So this is typifying, the foolish way of life, and the example of the poor innocent young man who falls into the clutches of this woman who wants to have sex with him. That this is given by way of example, of illustration. Now, it also is true, I think, that the way of life that is held up and proposed and defended in Proverbs is, on the whole, a socially conservative one. It's one where it's risk aversive, where you don't want to take chances, you want to stay in your place, and this again would be indicative of it. But then in chapter 8, you get the wise woman, if you like, or indeed Lady Wisdom. Wisdom personified as a woman. Does not wisdom call, and does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals she cries out, to you, O people, I call, and my cry is to all that live. Now, there are a number of things you might notice about that to begin with. First of all, she is not in the temple. I don't think they would have wanted to say that you couldn't find wisdom in the temple. Later on, Ben Sira will be very high on the temple, but Proverbs really has no great place for it. It's not concerned with that kind of thing. The place where you find wisdom is out in the marketplace or in the town square. The image here of wisdom going out and calling for people brings to mind, I'm not suggesting really that there was influence here, but it brings to my mind the stories about the Greek sophists, who went to the gymnasium and hung out trying to get themselves students. This is like a teacher going out into the town square, calling out to people, come and listen to my instruction. Take my instruction instead of silver, my knowledge rather than gold, for wisdom is better than jewels. I have good advice and sound wisdom. By me kings reign and rulers decree what is just. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently find me. Riches and honor are with me, enduring wealth and prosperity. Sounds like a college recruiter, right? That the way to wealth and fortune is get yourself a good education from a good university, and everything else will follow. So that I think is the premise of it. This whole passage, where wisdom is really praising herself, Modesty does not seem to be one of her virtues. It's been compared to poems that we have from the Hellenistic period, where the Egyptian goddess Isis sings her own praises. So now, whether in fact there was direct influence or whether it's just a like, there is certainly a good deal of Egyptian influence in the book of Proverbs. Wisdom here is often compared with Ma'at, which was a goddess, but also kind of a principle of wisdom. But anyhow, she is, on the one hand, she comes across almost as a goddess. Some people would actually argue that wisdom was a goddess. I don't see that really, because you never hear of anybody worshipping wisdom. But I think it's just a personification, where this figure is held up as a model, pretty much on a superhuman level. But then beginning in verse 22, you get a discussion of the role of wisdom in creation. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work. That is at least the conventional translation of this passage. The Hebrew verb there is kana. The normal verb for create is bara. The word kana basically means to acquire. Now, it can be used by extension. For example, when Cain is born in the book of Genesis, his mother says, I have acquired a son, using the word kana, which then gives him his name. But the basic idea of it is to acquire. Now, if you translated this, the Lord acquired me at the beginning of his work, you get a very different sense, because it means that wisdom is not actually something that's created. Wisdom is something that is there. Now, in support of that, we will see when we get to the book of Job that there is a hymn on wisdom that says that human beings can find all sorts of things, but they cannot find the way to wisdom. And only God knows the way to it. And God says, for you, fear of the Lord is wisdom. You don't need to find wisdom, you just need to fear me. Now, that also, I think, suggests that wisdom is something that's, in creation to begin with. And the greatness of God here is that he knows where it is and he finds it. He acquires it. Then he uses it in the creation of the world. Ages ago, I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. Now, of course, even in the book of Genesis, you do not have creation out of nothing. You start out in Genesis when the earth was tohu wavohu, waste and void. So it's disorganized, unstructured space is what you have at the beginning. Now, so before that, God acquired wisdom. And when there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped. Now, if you take it literally, of course, when it says, when there were no depths, I was brought forth, that is saying that wisdom was brought forth, that it did have a beginning. But it has a beginning that's prior to the rest of creation. Later on, in rabbinic literature, they will say that there are certain things that were created before the world, and one of them was the Torah, which is then identified with wisdom, and another is the name of the Messiah. And the idea is, I think, that these are so important, that they're more important than everything else that comes after them. So, before the mountains I had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth. When he established the heavens, I was there. when he drew a circle on the face of the deep. And you get scattered in through this a little sketch of an account of creation that's rather different from what you get in Genesis. When he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command. You get that recounted, for example, in Psalm 104, that this is how God created the world, is by driving back the waters and setting a limit and telling them, this is your limit, you may not pass. And then it said, I was beside him. Like a master worker is the translation in the NRSV, but it is not at all clear what that word means. Another possible translation of it is like as his darling. But master worker is certainly a possible interpretation of it. His darling is too, because it was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him. But in any case, what they want to tell you is that the Lord created the world with the help of wisdom. In other words, wisdom is built into the structure of the world. Now, this is another premise of wisdom, not at all a premise of the prophets for the most part, but it's a premise of wisdom that the world is intelligible, that there are clues to meaning that you can find, and that if you go about it properly, you can understand the world. We will see now in Koheleth and Job that there were some people raised questions about that. But I think this is the assumption. Things are orderly. Things happen for a purpose. If something happens, it's the consequence of something else. It's connected. Life is not random. So the task of wisdom then is to figure out how the world works. By observing it, you learn a lot just by observing nature. Because nature is, if you like, exhibit A of how the world works. And so this is why striving for wisdom makes sense. You may recall that in the book of Genesis, in the story of Adam and Eve, they were forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So I think there was probably a strand in ancient Israel that was suspicious of the wisdom of the wise. Sometimes the wise come off as rather cynical operators, but still, I think in the tradition as a whole, this would be affirmed that the world makes sense. And what you have to do is figure it out and follow it. Then in chapter 9, you have wisdom built her house. And so you have, first of all, wisdom as the wise woman held up as the example. Repeated here several times in Proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's really as explicit as you're going to get about your religious duties in Proverbs. And then the foolish woman is loud, she says, stolen water is sweet, bread eaten in secret is pleasant, but they do not know that the dead are there and her guests are in the depths of Sheol. So wisdom, they claim, gives life. Folly gives death. So this is the basic setup of wisdom. I didn't mention there are a couple of poems at the end of the book, including a famous one on the woman of substance, the capable wife, in Proverbs 31, verses 10 and following, which is certainly meant to be in praise of a certain kind of woman, but it's very much praise from the man's point of view. That the great thing about it is she goes out and She gets the wool and the flax, and she's like ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. She considers a field and buys it. And you get the impression that she does all the work, and the man sits around and takes compliments on it. But nonetheless, I think it is meant to be positive. I would also underline one other passage at the beginning of chapter 30. Chapter 30, verse 4, and this is part of the words of Agur. Who has ascended to heaven and come down? Who has gathered wind in the hollow of the hand? Who has wrapped up the waters in a garment? What is this person's name? And what is the name of the person's child? Surely you know. The point is, of course, nobody has. That would be picked up in Deuteronomy, which also says that the word is not in heaven that you should say who has to go up for it. It's right here in front of you. This, I think, would be very typical of the wisdom literature. At the end of this course, we'll come to the apocalyptic literature, which would say, absolutely, somebody has to go up to heaven and get it. And that's the only way you can really get wisdom. But that would be diametrically opposed to what you have here. Any question? Next week, we'll move on to the book of Koheleth, and then Job in the second lecture next week. And these are the very much in the tradition of Proverbs, but also very much probing them and not taking them for granted. Okay. Have a good weekend, I guess, even before I see you again, and finish up those papers.